decided to write a full-length novel at least a decade ago, and I had great ideas, many of them centering around the Indian National Army, which was a rebel army that fought with the Japanese against the British in the Second World War. It's just that they didn't work out, and somewhere along my second attempt at writing a novel, I segued into what later became Lying Eyes. So the horrors of the Second World War have been told, but in my opinion, Singapore hasn't got its fair share of coverage, given in spite of its pivotal role. So maybe it wasn't an American theater, and maybe the British suppressed some parts of what happened here. My exposure to the Shonan years came from this slim and hard-hitting book by N.I. Lowe. So he deals with the years in a understated and, like I said, in a style that really hits you hard. Some of what I read in this book grew into short stories, and two of those short stories grew into my novel, Lying Eyes. So I think historical fiction has a clear advantage when it comes to the lived experience, right? Because history will tell you about the lives of people, but historical fiction can tell you about their days and nights. History can tell you that, if people didn't bow properly before a Japanese soldier, they could be beaten up. Historical fiction can tell you what it felt like, even if, the writer wasn't around. So clearly there is an advantage that historical fiction has when it comes to the lived experience. On the other hand, when it comes to facts as well, there are many cases where historical fiction really excels at bringing out facts. So, Kazuo Ishiguro in his book drives home the point that there were also British Nazis, really. At least that's how I look at it. And there's this cool French police procedural written by Didier Dananx, and I think I'm pronouncing his name wrong, which talked about French Nazis, and it was very eye-opening at that point when it was published. So closer home, of course, J.G. Farrell wrote the wonderful Singapore Grip. And then, for example, Professor Kevin Blackburn has just released a book on comfort women in Singapore, Singaporean comfort women. It's in my shopping cart and I'll be reading it soon. But a few years ago, Jing Lee actually pioneered the thing talking about Singaporean comfort women. So historical fiction has a lot to contribute, yes, both to the lived experience, but also kind of digging up facts that are buried under the debris of history. So I don't know if I come across as confused, but I do think that there is a value to political correctness, and you do want to get over some things. In particular, Singapore had a very uncertain start. It was clouded by race riots, right? And what we see today is a triumph of society and culture where, there's, in my humble opinion, zero risk of racial violence. Of course, it needs a lot of monitoring and encouraging and deterrence. But what keeps things this way is not only the fact that some parts of memory were suppressed, but as said, there is an active effort to keep things going right. So now when it comes to some parts that were kind of wiped out from active discussion, so there is the aspect of comfort women and running dogs, collaborators with the Japanese. These are at minimum things that need discussion, right? That's just what I think. And I don't see the political incorrectness in bringing up this topic. And the fact that it might be perceived as politically incorrect, in my case at least, I didn't see a need to work around that. So I guess everyone finds their own path. Stories of the war, the wartime experience, I think it's fair to say that they are obfuscated by modernity, by the need to move on, get on with life, and the time that's elapsed. It has to be said that modernity, in a way, it's made retrieval of archives much easier. On the other hand, so the main issue really in my mind is: do people really want to think about the war years and what they mean for society today, based on the things that happened back then? Recently, a friend of mine commented that I'm an outsider in all this, and another friend actually felt offended on my behalf, but I didn't, because it is true. I have spent 20 years or 20 odd years in Singapore, so I am an outsider, of course, relative to people who've spent much longer, and so that goes without saying. And I really think it's really for the insiders to dwell on these topics, to think about the ideas of justice, right? And we cannot think about these things in an algorithmic kind of way. So it's not like a GDP calculation or something like that. So I think you have to think with the heart, or with the gut, whatever. Take your pick, and of course, a neurologist won't agree. Yeah, but what I really think will help to strike the balance is kind of being driven by a sense of justice, right? So South Korea, for example, has in the last few decades taken a certain path when it comes to the subject of comfort women, and Singapore hasn't. So is that a just path to take? That's the question to ask, I think. Yeah, I would say only do it if you like it. So there's a great novel that I'm about to finish now. The English title is The Mirror of Beauty. It's an Urdu novel. Kai Chand The Sare Asma. I read the Hindi translation, and because of the English hegemony, it won't get the acclaim that it deserves, in spite of being, I think, one of the greatest novels written anywhere. There's not much content about it, by the way, but I found this great interview by a journalist I quite admire. So he asked the writer, what's your advice to first-time writers? Like, is there a long cut and a short cut? So what do you want to say to them? And the writer, he said with a smile and in a very charming way, look, son, if I knew about long cuts and shortcuts, I wouldn't have been 70 years when I wrote my first novel. So, yeah, I think he also goes on to talk about, that you need a certain amount of experience, not just a great idea, to do justice, to really write a great work. So, yeah, I think the important thing is to like what you're doing, to read a lot, and to take advice from those writers that you want to write like, right? And feel free to disregard a lot of standard formulas, including the 3-act structure.